Let's begin by perhaps looking at the rearrangement, if you like, of the international economic structure as a result of the recession that we saw in 2008.
In fact, I think we want to go back even before 2008 and before the recession. And if we look in the past decade, we're going to see that the structure of the international economy has changed dramatically. Some of the obvious trends are, we talk about the BRIC countries now, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, who've been the engines of growth. We've seen the big growth initiatives and the successes in Asia. And what this has meant is that as those countries have been growing much faster than the average for the world, their share of world output has increased substantially. This is where the issue comes to bear at the IMF, is that the structure of voting rights at the IMF is linked to well, we call them the quotas. We called them the quotas, which were linked to the GDP, the size of countries. And countries with larger GDPs had a larger vote. They also made a larger contribution to the IMF. So now what we're seeing is that in this past decade, a whole new group of countries who've been growing very fast have increased their share of world output, but there's been no change in their voting rights at the IMF. So there's been a lot of frustration by new emerging economies, even developing countries, that they're underrepresented at the IMF.
So, Mark, if we were then to say, let's look at the ideal situation where the voting process and also the quotas are aligned to the size of the economies, what would that picture look like in terms of the size of the shareholders that are in the IMF? We can probably do maybe the top 5 or so.
Yes. I mean, I can give you an idea of some of the bigger emerging markets who are notably underrepresented. We know about China and India, who've been growing very rapidly. Their share is certainly underrepresented, maybe by at least 1% or more. But we've got Brazil, Mexico, Turkey, South Korea, and probably a lot of other Asian countries. The issue becomes, since you can think of it as 100 votes or 100% votes, if you want to increase somebody's votes, you have to take them away from somebody else. And this is where it gets a little bit painful and sticky at the fund, because you have some existing distribution of votes, which represents sort of a power distribution. And now somebody's going to have to lose votes in order for someone else to increase their voting power. And hence it's playing out as a battle largely between Europe and the United States.
In your view, where should those votes be coming from? Should they be coming from the US as one country, albeit with a larger GDP, or should it be coming from Europe, representing a number of countries but with a smaller GDP?
Well, right now the US has 17% of the votes at the IMF. It's the largest single shareholder and with the largest single amount of votes. The next country, I think, is Japan with about 6%. Then we go to France and Germany with about 5%. Now, that's just to show you the degree of difference between the US and the next country. Of course, the US is huge by comparison. But if we take all of Europe together, the European Union, we put all these 20-some countries together, they will have a voting share of something close to 30%, because it's a huge bloc. And what the European Union has not done, or the IMF has not done, they have not consolidated all of the European countries into one vote. And they've been resisting this. Perhaps it would dilute the power of the individual countries, because there would just be one voice at the table, instead of the many voices that you have right now.
It's going to be definitely an interesting discussion. Mark, I've got Andrew here. He's our guest host today, and he has got a question for you.
And I suppose my question to you, Mark, would be around probably beyond the IMF is what we're seeing over here is a changing of the guard economically, which goes beyond the IMF. If you look in the last financial crisis, you had many of the developing or developed economies which broke covenants regarding deficits, regarding debt to GDP ratios, and it was actually the emerging markets who retained within bounds over there. At what point do the emerging markets actually get the power to start enforcing the rules of the dictators, if I can call it that?
I think that's the name of this battle right now. The emerging markets want more say at the table at the IMF. I should stress the IMF is a very consensus-oriented organization, so there's rarely cases where there's a up or down vote on issues. However, the more votes you have, the more influence you carry in that executive boardroom. And the success cases, the Chinas, Indias, Brazils, other Asian tigers, their policies are working, and that helps them carry more weight, and they want the votes to go along with it, which is completely understandable. The IMF, there's a lot of discussion about economic policies. There's arguments in different directions. And that board of directors, they're the evidence. The countries that they represent are the evidence of success or not. And like you've noted, in the Western countries, we've seen a very embarrassing situation that the U.S. has carried us into the last major global recession.
Mark, how much of a danger is it? What's the risk here that, I mean, we speak of emerging markets and emerging countries like a group, but like one group. But I mean, we're talking about a large number of people here. We're talking about India and China combined, 2 billion people. We add in the billion from Africa, we're talking 3 billion people. So we're talking probably more than half the world's population. What danger is there that in all of that, us in Africa will likely be the biggest casualties and end up with nothing?
Africa is not one of the ascendant areas right now. Africa is doing much better economically in this past decade, after perhaps 2 decades during the 80s and the 90s of very poor performance. There's been a big resurgence since 2000. But when you look at the African share of global GDP, it's really been pretty static. Whereas when you look at Asia and South Africa, there's been a major increase in their share of world output. So Africa, I don't think, is going to be one of the beneficiaries of the ascendancy, not a direct beneficiary, I should say, of sort of these ascendant new emerging markets. I think the issue is going to, what's going to happen is when there's debates about issues in the IMF, for example, should the IMF give debt relief to overly indebted countries? For many years, the IMF argued that it would be improper to give debt relief, that it would create a moral hazard, that if it gave debt relief, its funds would be depleted. But then, very recently, around 2005, there was a change in the prevailing wisdom, and the IMF and the World Bank started offering debt relief. So it's the wisdom that comes out of our executive board, that comes out of our shareholders, the shareholders at the IMF, which are the countries, and conventional wisdom in economics, which tend to move things, and that wisdom can be different depending on where you're sitting, whether you're a debtor or a creditor or what part of the world you're sitting in.